the Screeching Window. It was the kind of place where fog clung to the ground like an eerie blanket, and the trees stood as silent sentinels, their twisted branches scraping against the sky. The village of Ashford was a small, quiet settlement, nestled deep within the forests of northern England. It had been isolated for as long as anyone could remember, hidden from the world by thick, ancient woods. The people who resided here were simple, laborious, and, of course, superstitious. And they had one story to whisper around in whispers, one that the very air seemed to carry along with it, the story of the Hollow House. It was a mansion, once owned by the very rich family Ashfords, but now lies abandoned. The mansion towered over the village, dark silhouette casting a long shadow over the surrounding trees. Nobody dared to go near it. It was said to be cursed, haunted by something not of this world. The most disturbing thing about the mansion, however, wasn't its eerie appearance or its history of tragedies. It was the window. At night, when the rest of the village was wrapped in silence, the window on the upper floor would creak open. But it wasn't any sound. It was a loud, high-pitched screech, as if the window was screaming in agony, a sound that sends chills down the spine of anyone who dares to listen. The villagers had learned long ago to avoid the house at all costs, especially after dark. The window was a warning, a reminder of the house's dark past. For years, no one dared to venture close to the Hollow House. But there was one person who could not let it rest: Jeremy. Jeremy was a young man, not more than 22 years of age, and his thirst for adventure was one no one in Ashford could ever match. He had heard stories about the Hollow House, its cursed window, and the terrifying noises that it made at night. Jeremy had heard the whispers of old-timers whose voices trembled as they recounted the house's tragic history. Jeremy, however, was never a believer. He felt that there had to be a logical reason, a rational reason. Superstitions, he thought, were just superstitions. One clear autumn evening, when the sun was setting below the horizon and painting the sky orange and purple, Jeremy decided on something. He would see the Hollow House. He had heard the stories. The Ashfords, a family of noble descent, had once lived there. The father, Gregory Ashford, was a man of great wealth and influence. But the family had simply disappeared one night, with nothing left behind but their stuff, and the haunting creaking of the window in the wind. Some said it was a terrible curse that had gotten them. Others said they were taken by something worse, a malevolent force that still lingers in the house. Jeremy stood by the edge of the village, looking at the manor through the trees. Its outline stood out in the distance, dark windows without the glow of light. Wind shook the leaves, bearing on it a faint something that was not quite comfortable. He shivered, but this wasn't from the chill. With a deep breath, Jeremy began walking towards the house. He had prided himself all along on his boldness of facing his fears head-on. But tonight, as he moved through the dense fog drifting over everything like a gloom, the feeling stirred in the back of his mind. There were these stories and all these things. Walking into that heart was a different issue. As he approached the gates of the Hollow House, he felt a sort of pull. The air was more heavy here, as though the very ground beneath his feet was saturated with sorrow. The mansion stood like a giant, its crumbling walls covered in ivy, its windows like dark eyes watching his every move. Then he heard it, the screeching. It was faint at first, almost inaudible over the rustling of the wind, but it grew louder as he stepped closer. The sound was unmistakable, the old window opening with a creak as if protesting the intrusion of time itself. Jeremy paused. He had heard the stories, but hearing the sound with his own ears was different. The chill that ran through him now was not just the autumn air. He had reached the front door, an ancient wooden thing, warped and faded with age. The door groaned as he pushed it open, the darkness inside seeming to swallow the light from the outside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of decay hanging in the air. He stepped into the entryway, his boots scraping against the stone floor. The house was silent now, the screeching window gone. But the feeling remained, an oppressive weight in the air, a sense that something was watching him, something that didn't want him here. Jeremy's heart was pounding in his chest as he moved inside the house. He found his way to the staircase that had its banister covered thick with dust. He stepped slowly, the old wooden creaking under him. Each step felt to echo through the empty house with every sound magnified under the stillness. As he walked to the second floor, he chanced upon the window. It was large, its panes cracked, and vines crawl through its frame, just the way the villagers had spoken of. It was in every way what they'd described. Yet, this wasn't what attracted his eyes to the window. Something shouldn't have been where he saw it. His reflection. A shadow that moved just out of the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but the room was empty. The reflection remained, though, staring back at him from the broken window. It was as if the glass was alive, capturing things that a human eye could not. With racing heart, Jeremy took a step closer to the window, his hand stretching out to touch the glass. The moment his fingers made contact with it, the air grew colder, so cold that it felt as if 100 years of frozen solitude had gathered in this very room. Then came the whisper, "Get out." It was a voice, but no voice Jeremy had ever heard in his life. It sounded icy cold, like the wind of a crypt. Then it did it again, screeching. The wind howled outside, whipping through the trees with an unearthly ferocity. Jeremy stood in the heart of the hollow house, his pulse pounding in his ears as he tried to make sense of the whisper he had just heard. The words still hung in the air, lingering like a cold mist, seeping into his skin. "Get out." He spun around in a circle, scanning the room. This mansion seemed darker, emptier than the very air he could breathe, and it was making him more suffocating by the second. That whisper is gone now, but that presence remains. Heavy, suffocating. He knew it wasn't the wind. There's something in this house. It just didn't want him around. But Jeremy'd gone too far to be able to turn back. He breathed in deeply, forcing his shaking hands to steady as he adjusted the grip on the flashlight in his hand. The narrow beam of light flickered over the old furniture, chairs draped in dusty sheets, tables covered in decades-old grime. The air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew, but beneath it, there was something else. A faint, sharp odor that was almost metallic. It lingered in the back of his throat, choking him as he moved further into the house. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, bouncing off the peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards. Every shadow seemed to twist as he passed, every corner hiding something he couldn't quite see. The house was like a living thing, its walls breathing with a rhythm that only it understood. Jeremy had read about haunted houses before, but he had never read anything about this. The more time spent in the house, the more it seemed to pulse and throb with an otherworldly energy. The house was more than an inanimate structure. It was a presence, a living consciousness that watched him for his mistake. He came to the end of the corridor and stopped in front of a door that was shut. The door was unlike all the others. It did not look decayed or forgotten. The wood was polished, untouched by time. But there was something strange about it that made Jeremy hesitate. It was as though the door was calling him toward it, its presence far more intense than any other. Without thinking, he reached for the handle and twisted it. The door groaned in protest, as if it were reluctant to open. But Jeremy persisted, pushing it open to reveal a dimly lit room. The room was small, but it felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by the faintest breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. There was a big, ornate mirror in the center of the room. Its frame was polished dark wood, carved intricately with designs that seemed to shift when he looked at them too long. What was most striking, though, was the mirror itself. It wasn't reflection. It was a doorway. Jeremy took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got to the mirror, the colder the air seemed to grow. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as he looked into the glass. At first, he saw only his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, his expression tense with fear. But as he stared longer, the reflection began to change. It wasn't just him anymore. Behind him, in the reflection, was a figure. A woman, pale and dressed in what must have been an old-fashioned gown, her long hair hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see the outline of her features, sharp, angular, almost too perfect. She was staring at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that made his stomach lurch with fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. He spun around, his breath caught in his throat. The room was empty. He was alone. But the woman from the mirror was still there, in the reflection. Her gaze followed him, and he realized with a sinking feeling that she was trying to tell him something. Before he could make sense of what was happening, the whisper returned, this time louder, more insistent. "Help me." The words were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were unmistakable. Jeremy turned back to the mirror, his pulse racing. The woman's lips were moving, but no sound escaped them. The message was clear. She wanted him to help her. But what did she need help with? And why was she trapped in the mirror? His mind ran around with all the questions in his head, but one thought kept reverberating throughout his consciousness. The fear within her eyes. It was the same fear that overtook him when he walked into this house. A fear which seemed to grow within him second by second. The feeling that there was something in that house he wasn't going to understand at all. Something ancient and evil. The room seemed to grow colder still as Jeremy's breath fogged in the air. He stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection now distorted by the fog that had begun to fill the room. The woman's figure was clearer now, her face filled with terror. Her hands were pressed against the glass, as if she were trying to break free. And then, something changed. The surface of the mirror rippled, like water when a stone is thrown into it. The reflection of the woman began to twist, her face contorting in agony as if she were trapped in some kind of invisible prison. Her eyes locked with his, and she reached out a hand toward him, her fingers just inches from the glass. The whisper turned into a scream. "Help me! Get out!" Now words had become a roar that filled the room, crashed into Jeremy's head. His heart pounded against his chest as he stumbled back, reaching out for the door. But as his fingers brushed against the handle, the house seemed to react. The floor beneath him creaked loudly, as if something massive was moving just below him. The walls groaned. For the briefest instant, Jeremy could hear something nails on a chalkboard, scratching. The noise deafened him, overwhelmed. Jeremy slammed the door shut, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. He backed away, a cold sweat trembling in every muscle. He didn't know what he had just seen, but one thing for sure. The hollow house was alive. The walls were whispering. The air was thick with secrets. And the mirror was not just a reflection. It was a portal, a gateway to something far more sinister than he could comprehend. He had to leave. But as he turned to flee, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. The window. The one that had been silent since his arrival. It was open again, and the screaming had come back. The air in the hollow house was thicker now, as though the walls themselves were strangling him. Jeremy had tried to shake off the events of the last few hours, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw that woman's face, twisted, terrified, pressing her hand against the mirror. Her eyes had contained desperation, but it wasn't something like that that haunted him. He saw something ripple from her. The fear that had clawed at him refused to let go. He wanted to know. Jeremy's resolve deepened as he descended farther into the house. The sense of wonder had been born out of curiosity, but this was something else calling, something hungry. The house shifted, like a big beast sensing its prey. There was nothing but the noise from the screeched window, like it was howling through every inch of the house, calling, challenging him to find what was beneath. As he strode down the empty halls, his flashlight flickered off in his hand, casting sinister shadows on the walls. It was an old house, much older than he'd realized. The faded wallpaper, the creaking floors, and the faint groans of the building said much about neglect. But this was more than that. This place had something about it that was ancient, something that didn't belong in this time. The halls seemed endless, stretching out before him as if the house itself was playing tricks on his mind. He turned left and right, the oppressive silence closing in around him. And then, he found it. A door, barely visible against the peeling wallpaper, almost as if it were hiding from him. Jeremy hesitated. There was a coldness around this door, an icy pull that made him want to turn and run. But he couldn't. His feet moved of their own accord, drawn to the door like a moth to the flame. The house seemed to whisper to him, urging him forward. He grasped the tarnished brass handle, feeling its weight in his hand. The door groaned open ominously, and Jeremy stepped into a darkened room. It was small, much smaller than the other rooms in the house, and its air was thick with mildew and dust. But there was something else, something indescribable. It was as though the very air had a weight to it pressing down on him. The floor beneath him seemed wrong, too soft to be real, as if the floor were swallowing his footfalls. His flashlight swept through the room, revealing its source, the floor covered in a thick, dark carpet. But it was not dirt. There were marks, strange, streaked patterns that seemed to move if he looked at them for too long. He stepped forward, his breath shallow in his chest. And that's when he saw it. In the corner of the room, hidden by shadows, was a trap door. The moment his eyes fell on it, he knew. He knew that whatever lay beneath was the key to everything. But something inside of him was telling him to stop, to turn away before it was too late. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for him. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle of the trap door. The moment his fingers brushed the cold metal, the screeching from the window grew louder, almost deafening. It felt like the very walls of the house were shaking with it. With a force that seemed beyond his own, the trapdoor swung open, revealing a set of narrow, rickety stairs leading down into an inky black abyss. Jeremy hesitated, standing at the threshold, staring into the darkness. The air down there was colder, almost frigid, and there was a musty, rotten scent that rose up from the depths. The urge to go down was too much. He could not explain why, but the pull was too strong. The house was calling to him, its hunger insatiable. Without another thought, he stepped onto the first creaking stair. It felt like every step was leading him deeper into the earth, that each stair beneath his weight groaned under the weight, the darkness down there reaching up for him. His flashlight began to flicker again. He'd see flashes of light dancing across the narrow walls, and each flash had its revelation. Ancient symbols etched into the stone walls, lines and shapes unlike anything he'd ever read before. The air grew thicker, colder still. He could hear his own heartbeat, the pounding in his ears, as he descended further. His breath became ragged, and for the first time since entering the house, Jeremy felt a chill of real terror crawl up his spine. What was down there? What had the house been hiding? His head was filled with questions, none of which made any sense at all. As his foot touched the bottom step, he found himself in a huge chamber. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were covered in twisted faces and grotesque figures that seemed to shift and change when he looked away. The room was enormous, stretching far beyond the reach of his flashlight, and the air felt alive with something he couldn't name. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface worn with age. Around it, the floor was covered in what looked like dried blood, dark stains that seeped into the cracks between the stones. A faint glow emanated from the altar, casting an eerie light across the chamber. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make his skin crawl. Then he saw it as his vision slowly accommodated to the faint light. A figure on the altar lay there. It was a woman, her body pale and twisted, her limbs contorted at unnatural angles. She was dressed in old, tattered clothing, her hair matted and tangled around her face. But it was her eyes that caught Jeremy's attention. Her empty, hollow eyes, staring straight at him, as though she had been waiting for him. A scream lodged itself in his throat, but no sound came out. The same woman lay on the altar from whom Jeremy first had that impression in the mirror. Jeremy took one step forward with dragging his feet on the bloodied floor. He extended a hand in trembling and was about to touch her when, before reaching, the ground shook underneath him. The walls looked alive, shuddering in an otherworldly power. Then, a few distance away, he could hear it, the tramping of feet. Slow, heavy steps, coming to him. It was cold once more, and a low voice boomed through the darkness. "You should not have come here." Jeremy spun around, but no one. Not that he could see, anyhow. Just the sound of the footfalls, coming closer and closer, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get out. He had to run. But the door, the trap door, was now sealed shut, the stone covering it as if it had never been opened. And that was when he realized something far worse. He was not alone anymore. There was darkness in the hollow house that pressed upon Jeremy like something alive, suffocating him with every breath he made. His heart beat in his chest and echoed through his ears, as though it drummed from far away. But it wasn't the beat of his heart he listened for. It was the footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the stairs after him and into the chamber below. He thought he had imagined them as but some parrying product of his brain, brought forth by the fear within his brain and the uncanny impression from the house itself. And when standing there frozen in the room, his eyes fixed onto the stone altar, there were the steps growing louder, closer. The cold stone beneath his feet seemed to grow colder still, and the air itself felt as if it were thickening around him. The shadows in the room shifted unnaturally, stretching and twisting in ways that made no sense, like they were trying to move, trying to reach out to him. And then he heard it. A voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." Jeremy turned, his eyes scouring the dark recesses of the room. But there was nothing, nobody. Only the fitful gleam of his flashlight casting erratic shadows on the stone walls. He stepped forward toward the altar, his feet scrabbling against the floor, slick with blood. Each step shot a shiver through him. The woman's body still lay there, motionless, her pale skin almost glowing in the faint light. But something was different now. Her eyes, that seemed empty and hollow before, glimmered now as though they were alive. Her eyes followed him when he walked closer, intently focusing on him in such an intensity that it made his breath catch in his throat. His hands trembled as he reached to touch her, but before he could make contact, a low growl vibrated through the air, coming from deep within the walls of the chamber. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and his breath came out in visible clouds. Something was moving in the shadows. He swiveled, shining the flashlight into each corner. But the glare reveals nothing. The growl was lost beneath a faint sound, which resembles almost a whisper. But in it, he cannot identify any words. They sound to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, like they are surrounding him or filling his mind with dread, foreboding. And the woman on the altar suddenly jerked and twisted, curling fingers like a puppet wanting to move and speak. Jeremy took a step back. He felt his heart thumping fast, breathing racing. This could not happen this way. "She's not dead. She's waiting," the whispering voice seemed to say. The shadows around the altar seemed to thicken, coiling and twisting like living things as they reached toward him. Jeremy could feel them closing in. He could sense the air growing heavier and pushing down on him with suffocating force. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they called out to him from behind the veil of reality. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but the trap door, the way out, was gone. The stone floor had sealed it shut, as if the house itself had swallowed the exit. The growl came back louder, this time with a low, guttural laugh that seemed to reverberate through his bones. The shadows reached out, curling around his legs, pulling him toward the altar. "You shouldn't have come here." He heard the words in his head, louder now than he had before, and in that moment, Jeremy finally realized. He understood why he had come here. This house was no ordinary dwelling. It was not just an old relic from a dead past. It was living, and it was ravenous. The woman on the altar started to move once again, this time with purpose. Her body convulsed violently as though something was forcing her upwards. Her eyes met his, and within that moment, Jeremy was bombarded by pure terror. Her mouth opened, but that was not a human scream emanating from her, merely a distorted, unrecognizable sound that rent a hole through the reality itself. "No," Jeremy murmured to himself, hardly able to tear his eyes off the horror unfolding before him. His legs felt frozen to the floor, and he couldn't move his body anymore. The shadows started to thicken, swirling in around him, and then he knew that they were not shadows. They were creatures, dark, shapeless things that had been sequestered in the walls of the house, waiting patiently for someone dumb enough to stumble into their domain. He attempted to scream, but his voice disappeared in that oppressive silence. He felt uncontrollable shakes through his entire body as a truth went through his head. The man realized that he was shut in alone with those beings, not human. The woman on the altar rose fully now, her movements jerky, unnatural. She was not alive in the way that he understood. She was something else, something bound to this place, something bound to the darkness that filled the hollow house. And then, with a sudden violent movement, she lunged at him. Jeremy screamed as the shadows closed in around him, wrapping themselves around his limbs, pulling him down into the blood-soaked floor. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the woman's face, her eyes wide and filled with an expression that Jeremy recognized all too well. It was the same expression he had seen in the mirror, the same expression he had seen before everything had gone wrong. The face of someone trapped in the house, as he was. The freezing air inside the hollow house clung to Jeremy's skin, pushing its way into him like an invisible pressure. His breathing was shallow, each exhale a visible thing in the chilled atmosphere that had invaded the house. The shadows stretched and twisted around him. They were no longer something of his imagination, but dark, pulsing beings creeping closer. That was the woman's voice still resonating in his mind. The warning, "You shouldn't have come here." But now it was already too late for regrets. The stone walls of the chamber seemed to close in on him, trapping him inside the house that seemed alive, aware of his every move. The air was heavy, hard to breathe, hard to think. His mind was racing as he tried to make sense of everything. Was it real? Or was this all a dream, a nightmare from which he couldn't wake? He could hear the whispers again, this time softer but more insistent. The voices had multiplied. They were echoing from every side, swirling around him like a storm of fear. "You are not alone," it seemed they chanted, the words becoming a chorus that reverberated in the deepest recesses of his mind. His eyes darted to the altar, and for a brief moment, he saw her again. The woman who had once been lying motionless, now standing with a twisted, unnatural grace. Her eyes were empty, black voids, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that sent a shiver through Jeremy's spine. She wasn't dead. She hadn't been dead. But then, what was she? Jeremy stumbled backward, his heart pounding louder now than the whispers, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. "No, no!" He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His legs refused to carry him forward. Yet the darkness that had been creeping at the edges of his mind took form in front of him. The walls seemed to melt away. revealing the true horror of the hollow house. Before him now stood the truth, the source of the whispers, the source of the shadows. A vast, endless corridor that stretched far into the distance, a twisted, rotting version of the house he thought he knew. The floor beneath him seemed to warp, shifting like liquid as the walls trembled. And in the distance, a figure approached, moving slowly toward him, its form shrouded in the darkness. Jeremy. It was his mother's voice, yet it was wrong. Twisted, hollow, as though dragged from the depth of some ancient nightmare. And the figure moving closer had her face, yet she was no longer that woman. It was something else wearing the skin, manipulating it like a puppet. The figure grinned, a grin that spread too wide across its face, exposing teeth far too sharp to be human. "You should have left. You should have never come back." Jeremy took a step back, his feet unsteady. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the very ground he stood on was holding him in place, forcing him to witness the horrors of the hollow house. His mother's twisted doppelganger drew closer, and Jeremy could feel its breath, cold and rancid against his skin. "You never left." The voice was more than a whisper now. It was all around him, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through his very bones. "This house is your prison." The words imprinted themselves in his brain, their meaning clear to him now. The hollow house wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was a prison. This was a place where souls were locked up, condemned to replay their worst fears, darkest nightmares for eternity. Jeremy's eyes grew wide in horror as the truth began to settle in. The shadows were not just manifestations of fear. They were the souls of the damned, the lost, the broken, forever bound to the house. He never left. This house had been his prison long before he had ever stepped foot inside it, and the walls just sort of breathed. He felt himself being pulled down closer toward the middle of the house, and back to where it had started all again. The altar, the stone, the blood. The figure of his mother was gone now, replaced by something even more horrifying. The darkness coalesced into a shape, an ancient, monstrous being, towering over him, its face hidden in shadows, its presence so oppressive that it felt as though the very air around him was choking him. It reached out, its hand massive and gnarled, stretching toward him like a claw, and its voice, deep and guttural, spoke. "You are mine now, Jeremy. You have been mine all along." The pressure was a chokehold. Jeremy strained for freedom, but the darkness had ensnared him tight. Each movement was as heavy as lead, every inhalation a struggle. The body felt it was dragging toward the figure as he struggled against the irresistible power coursing through his body with every beat of his heart, and an ache that felt ready to explode from his chest. Then, suddenly gaining clarity, Jeremy realized something that made his blood run cold. He was not alone in this confinement. He was not the first. He had it all seen before. There was the woman on the altar, the whispering of shadows, the growls from creatures in the walls. He had seen everything in the mirror. The hollow house had claimed him before even stepping inside. He had become part of the house, and so, as one final desperate shriek, he was consumed. The darkness swallowed him whole.